Hi, Brett Fortin with Inside U.S. Trade. On the question of the UK's evolving regulatory framework, there's a clear sense among the business community that there wants to be frictionless trade between the EU and UK on goods, services, specifically financial services. But what about the clear divergences between the EU and US systems? And is there any sense that the UK should adopt, as Wilbur Ross has said, a regulatory framework that is more in line with what the US has? What is the business side of that?
I think we have one in the back.
Thank you. It's question mainly to Karl, and it's about the GAFA stuff. Isn't it right that the concerns about the so-called GAFA, which some Americans call the frightful five, are coming to the front in this country as well? I would encourage you to read Tim Berners-Lee's piece in the Financial Times yesterday, the founder of the internet. And it seems to me that the countries are coming to the same wavelengths on that problem, which is a great news for Red Flag. Means lots of business for you.
And maybe last one in the back.
Thank you, Andrew. You're at CEO of Developed Trade Law. To the question about grandfathering contracts to address the situation where contracts continue beyond the Brexit date, I am struggling to understand what kinds of clauses or provisions could actually be included in a trade agreement or whatever it would be, provisos that could address some of those contractual concerns that would inevitably arise. So as a lawyer, I really am struggling to understand, so I would be interested to hear a little bit more about that. Thank you.
So maybe we'll start with Marjorie on the first question.
Sure. So the first question related to sort of regulatory divergences between the U.S. and the EU and which way the UK would cleave. My sense is we start from the premise that if you're looking for maintaining as frictionless a relationship as possible, and we all recognize it won't be friction-free, that you will want the UK's regulatory regime to follow as closely as possible, if not mirror the EU's regulatory framework. Having said that, as I said in my earlier remarks, there may well be instances where there are significant, well, maybe significant, but divergences nonetheless between the US and the EU approach to regulating a given industry, where we would want to see the UK have a bit more flexibility. So this is somewhat akin to what Theresa May has talked about as managed divergence, and obviously Brussels has rejected that out of hand, but I do think that it will be a balancing act, and I don't think it's an either or. I think we're going to have to look at it potentially on a case-by-case basis. I would just say, I have to speak up about the GAFA issue, and simply say that if you look, for example, at these recent digital taxation proposals that are floating out of Brussels, you can't help but recognize that these are measures that are directly aimed at American companies. And that's been a perception, I think, that has only grown on the part of the business community, a sense that this commission, even more than in past years, has taken approaches that seem to penalize American companies in order to put European companies in a more competitive position. I think the digital taxation proposals that are currently being considered are the classic example of that. So it is the question of the Commission being dictatorial. It is a question of whether companies companies are being treated fairly regardless of where they're headquartered.
Marjorie, sounds like a Europe first policy. Karl,
Just directly on the GAFA thing, it's not a question of whether or not it's right that this issue is coming to the fore, but it is much more likely to come to the fore with after Brexit, or with less UK influence. And I do agree with Marjorie. Like the actual thrust of the proposals appears to be to try and tax successful American companies, or target successful American companies in such a way that the Europe will create its own Google, or Europe will create its own Amazon through a punitive tax system on the existing Google, or the existing Facebook, and that possibly, or almost certainly, isn't the right way to encourage innovation in the tech sector in Europe.
do you want to take a shot at the third question?
Yeah, sure. And also, I'd like to just talk a bit about the regulatory framework. I mean, on the grandfathering of contracts, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that it doesn't necessarily, or probably actually wouldn't be within a trade agreement, because a trade agreement would ultimately define the terms of the UK's relationship with the European Union from, say, whenever it is, 2021, 2022 onwards, whereas the grandfathering of contracts is ultimately, once you kind of get into the transition and you look towards a trade agreement, you have to have some kind of adaptation period. And ultimately, in the grandfathering of contracts, that's where that fits into the piece. So I'm not saying it doesn't have to have a legal basis, but I don't necessarily think it would be in the trade agreement. Within the kind of regulatory framework, I just want to make 2 points there. I mean, don't forget, I mean, we're talking about future UK-EU trade, and the UK's been on its own and developing its own rules. In financial services, the UK already has some rules that are different from the EU, or rules that the EU does not have. I mean, if you think of what the UK has done in terms of the ring fencing of investment banking from retail banking, that's not something that the Europeans have done, but the UK has done that as a fully paid up member of the European Union. So, we don't have to assume that every single rule and regulation is identical and is implemented in exactly the same way. It's not the case at present, and obviously it won't be after the UK leaves the EU. And then in terms of triangulating between the UK and the EU in its relationship, and the UK and the United States, in financial services, the kind of principles that the regulations that have been developed in 2009, 2010, the genesis of them is ultimately at the global level. So at the highest level, the three economies are kind of signed up to reasonably similar playbooks. There are obviously differences in terms of how they kind of go away and implement those, and how they actually work within the specific jurisdictions. But to the extent there's an opportunity here to strengthen regulatory cooperation between a post-Brexit UK and the European Union, and a trade agreement or whatever other platforms there are between the United States and the United Kingdom can strengthen regulatory cooperation between those two economies. If we were to continue to think, as we were doing during the TTIP discussions, about EU-US cooperation, and those sides have actually tried to strengthen the regulatory cooperation in financial services that they do since 2016, then everybody could be a winner if we had a more coherent set of global regulations that enhanced and promoted more cross-border business in financial services. So that's how I look at that issue.
Great. And one last point on the grandfathering. It might be that an agreement states that the parties won't require a license to finish an existing contract, whereas in a future relationship you might need a license to provide a particular service that's across the channel. Let me wrap it up on behalf of WITA. Thanks very much. This fantastic panel, fantastic day. Thanks to our audience filling up the room. I think it was done very well. Let me turn it over to Ken to
Thanks. Thank you to the panel. Thank you, Tim. Thanks for all of you for sticking with us. Big shout out and thanks to Red Flag. Karl, thank you for your team. Reminder, there's a little, the mugs on your table, the bags, and there's a special gift waiting.